Hello, and welcome to this brief introduction to poetry. Marion Moore said, "In a poem, the words should be as pleasing to the ear as the meaning is to the mind." To begin, we're going to talk about the human brain for a moment. The human brain is divided into two parts. Each half has its own function. Logic and reality is controlled by the left part of the brain, while creativity and emotions is controlled by the right side of the brain. So to clarify, when you're looking at big puffy clouds, the right part of your brain, or the creative part, says, hey, that one looks like a horse, or that one looks like a bunny. And the left side of your brain, the more logical part, says, hey, it's nothing more than a cloud, stupid. It's the more reasoning part. So which half do you use when you study poetry? Well, poetry does require creativity, and it requires emotion, and it requires artistic quality. But poetry also requires logic, which is controlled by the left side of the brain. So, survey says that poetry requires both sides of the brain. It requires both sides. For the left brain, recognizing certain devices used within a poem will give the left brain something to concentrate. We'll start out with listening devices. Rhyme. Rhyme, to begin, is the repetition of sounds. For example, hat, cat, brat, fat, all those rhyming words that you learned in second grade. Here's a poem by Shel Silverstein that you might remember. My beard grows to my toes. I never wears no clothes. I wraps my hair around my bear, and down the road I goes. Rhythm. Rhythm is the beat. When reading a poem out loud, you may notice a sort of sing-song quality to it, just like in nursery rhymes. This is accomplished by the use of rhythm. Rhythm is broken into 7 types. There's iambic, anapestic, trochaic, dactylic, monosyllabic, spondaic, and accentual. These here, iambic, anapestic, trochaic, and dactylic, are mostly used, while the other are less common. These identify patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables in a line of poetry. That means one syllable is pronounced stronger and one syllable is softer. And the U is the symbol for an unstressed syllable, and a line or slash is a symbol for a stressed one. In iambic form, our syllables that are stressed come after an unstressed. In an anapestic, in a 3-syllable word, it would be unstressed, unstressed, stressed. Trochaic, we have stressed and then unstressed syllables. Or in dactylic, it's stressed, unstressed, unstressed. Okay, well, bear with me. Meter. Talk briefly about meter. Meter is the length of a line of poetry based on what type of rhythm is used. The length of a line of poetry is measured in metrical units called feet. If you want to take a minute and pause, that's fine. You can go ahead and do so. I'll continue on. Each foot consists of 1 unit of rhythm. So if the line is iambic or trochaic, a foot of poetry has 2 syllables. If the line is anapestic or dactylic, a foot of poetry has 3 syllables. Get it? Well, let me explain a little further. This is where you're going to start sounding like geometry class. So you left brainers are going to love this. Each set of syllables is 1 foot, and each line is measured by how many feet are in it. The length of the line of poetry is then labeled according to how many feet are in it. So a monometer has 1 foot, dimeter 2, trimeter 3, tetrameter 4, pentameter 5, hexameter 6, 7, 8. You get the idea. Very rarely do we go more than 8 feet per meter. Okay? So if I didn't confuse you enough, I'll confuse you a little bit more. Read this poem out loud. Make the rhythm evident. Which syllables are more pronounced? Which are naturally softer? She walks in beauty. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies. And all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes, thus mellow to the tender light, which heaven to gaudy day denies. Okay, I know I'm boring you with this, and we'll get to the to the meat in a second, but I do want you to see how the syllables do affect the way a poem flows and sounds, ultimately leaving an impression on the poem. We'll continue on. Alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of the initial letter or sound in two or more words. You would recognize alliteration in tongue twisters. So if I said, how much do would a dewdrop do if a dewdrop did drop dew? That's an example of alliteration, okay? And we'll keep going, but as you can see in one line of poem here, we've got alliteration, clouds climbs. Here'd be another line of alliteration, starry skies. You get the idea. If there is more than one sound in the same line of a poem, that'd be considered alliteration. So tongue twisters are basically alliteration on steroids. Onomatopoeia. These are fun. You learned these when you were a child as well, reading those phonic books. Onomatopoeia are words that spell out sounds, words that sound like what they mean. So growl, hiss, pop, boom, crack. Those are all examples of onomatopoeia. Okay. If you remember the old Batman cartoons, you're probably not that old, but there was a lot of onomatopoeia in those episodes. Okay, so what does it look like in poems? Well, if in this example by Shel Silverstein called Noise Day, you see some onomatopoeia here: screech, buzz, clang, toot, bang. That's onomatopoeia. Okay, so repetition. Repetition is using the same key word or phrase throughout the poem. This should be fairly self-explanatory, but at the risk of sounding like a broken record, this is example of repetition. Time to spend, time will eventually. Time to mend, show us the truth. Time to hate, time is a mystery. Time to wait, time is measured. Okay, you get the idea. Which words, phrases were repeated? Time. Time, 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 time. Let me back up. Time. Okay, that is an example of repetition. So, continue on. Refrain. Refrain is the repetition of one or more phrases or lines at the end of a stanza. So what does that look? Oh, it can also be an entire stanza that is repeated periodically throughout a poem, kind of like a chorus of a song. So, to give you an example, one of my favorite poems, Phenomenal Woman by Maya Angelou. Pretty woman, wonder where my secrets lie. I'm not cute or built to suit a fashion model size. But when I start to tell them, they think I'm telling lies. I say it's in the reach of my arms, the span of my hips, the stride of my step, the curl of my lips. I'm a phenomenal woman. Phenomenally phenomenal woman. That's me. Remember those lines, because I'm going to keep going. I walk into a room just as cool as you please, and to a man, the fellows stand or fall down on their knees. Then they swarm around me, a hive of honeybees. I say, it's the fire in my eyes, and the flash of my teeth, the swing of my waist, and the joy in my feet. I'm a woman, phenomenally. Phenomenal woman, that's me. I won't keep going, but as you can see, these lines here are repeated throughout this poem. We call that the refrain, and again, it's like the chorus of a song. That's refrain. Next term, simile. You remember this, I'm sure, from 3rd, 4th, 5th grade and beyond. Simile is a comparison between two things that are unrelated using the word like or as. So for example, if I say Joe is as hungry as a bear, or in the morning Ray is as angry as a lion, that's an example of a simile. Let's see what this looks like in a poem. Here's one by Archibald MacLeish. A poem should be palpable and mute as a glob fruit, silent as a slee-worn stone, or casement ledges where the moss has grown. A poem should be wordless. Where did you see any similes in here? Right there. A poem should be as palpable and mute as a globed fruit. Okay. Then we also seen it here, silent as a sleeve. And you get the idea. Metaphor. Metaphors are similar to similes. However, we avoid using the word like or as. An implied comparison between two usually unrelated things. So, for example, Lenny is a snake, Jenny is a mouse when it comes to standing up for herself. The difference between a simile and a metaphor is that a simile requires either like or as, where a metaphor does not. It simply states that something is something else just to make that comparison. So a metaphor is an implied comparison between two usually unrelated things. Here's an example. When it comes to using a metaphor device in poetry, a poet can either make the entire poem a metaphor for something or put little metaphors throughout the poem. The following poem is one big metaphor. Oops. And I am missing that poem. We'll continue. Hyperbole. A hyperbole is an exaggeration for the sake of emphasis. For example, I may sweat to death. The blood bank needs a river of blood. Those are examples of hyperboles. They're extreme exaggerations. Okay. Personification. Personification is giving human qualities and characteristics to inanimate objects, ideas, or animals. So, for example, the sun stretched its lazy fingers over the valley. That's an example of personification. Since the sun doesn't have arms or fingers or hands, how can it stretch its lazy fingers over the valley? It can't. But we give it qualities that allow it to do so. We call that personification. Symbol. A symbol is a word or image that signifies something other than what it literally represents. Usually dark or black images in poem often are used to symbolize death, where light and white images are used to symbolize life. These are other images that symbolize something. Imagery. Imagery is using words to create a picture in the reader's mind. It's a very powerful tool. Imagery is when a poet or a writer has a way with words that you can actually envision in your mind pictures and images. Free verse. Free verse is poetry that follows no rules. Just about anything goes. That doesn't mean it doesn't use any devices. It just means that this type of poetry does not follow traditional conventions such as punctuation, capitalization, rhyme, scheme, meter, etc. So for example, fog. The fog comes on little cat feet. It sits looking over harbor and city on silent haunches and then moves on. There's no rhyme, there's no rhythm, there's no scheme. It's free verse. Allusion. Allusion's one of my favorites. It's a reference to another piece of literature or history. For example, here's a piece from Romeo and Juliet. She hath Dane's wit. This is allusion to Roman mythology and the goddess Diana. The three most common types of allusion refer to the mythology, the Bible, and Shakespeare's writings. Okay, she hath Diane's wit, again making reference to a well-known piece of mythology. A lot of literature and poetry does make reference to well-known pieces like the Bible verses or Shakespearean writing, or maybe even the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so that concludes my quick introduction to poetry. If you need to watch this again, feel free to do so. And again, if you need to contact me, you can send me an email at angelica.lozano.garcia@gmail.com. Thank you.